I came back from signing the final settlement papers and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could even turn the key. $43 million. That was the number printed on the certified check sitting in the manila envelope on the passenger seat next to me. My name was on it. My late father's name was on the trust documents, and I had just spent the last 4 hours in a downtown Chicago conference room, making it all legally, permanently, undeniably mine. I was 29 years old, exhausted down to my bones, and completely alone in a parking garage on a Tuesday afternoon. I should have driven straight home. Instead, I made the mistake of calling my mother to tell her it was finally over. She picked up on the second ring, which should have been my first warning. My mother never picks up on the second ring. My name is Ivy. My father passed away 8 months before that afternoon, and the legal battle over his estate had consumed every waking hour of my life since the morning of his funeral. He was a quiet man, a structural engineer who spent 30 years building commercial infrastructure across the Midwest and saved every dollar he ever made. He never drove a luxury car. He never took extravagant vacations. He wore the same brand of plain white sneakers from a discount store until they fell apart, then bought the exact same pair again. Nobody who knew him socially would have guessed the number in his accounts. That was exactly how he wanted it. What I did not know, standing in the parking garage with that envelope on the seat next to me, was that 3 people inside my mother's house had known the number for weeks, and they were waiting for me to walk through that door. Before I tell you what I found when I got there, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. If you have ever been betrayed by the people who are supposed to love you most, you are going to want to hear exactly how this ended. I pulled up to the house I grew up in just after 5 in the evening. My mother's silver SUV was in the driveway. So was my older brother's truck, and parked half on the curb the way he always did, like traffic laws did not apply to him, was my brother-in-law's black sedan. His name was Philip. He was married to my older sister, whose name was Fiona, and he had always introduced himself at family events as a financial advisor, which was a generous title for a man whose primary financial strategy involved borrowing money from relatives and never paying it back. I noticed all 3 vehicles before I even opened my door. I noticed them, and I told myself it was just a welcome home dinner. I told myself my family was simply there to celebrate with me. I picked up the envelope and walked toward the front porch. The living room window was open. It was early October, the kind of cool evening where you crack the windows just enough to let the air in, and that small gap was enough for me to hear every word being spoken inside before I even touched the door handle. Philip was talking. His voice carried the specific confidence of a man who has never once been held accountable for anything in his life. He was saying that I would not fight them. He said I was young, I was soft, I was still grieving, and that grief made people easy. He said the settlement was significant and that if they moved quickly, before I had time to speak to an independent attorney, they could position the entire thing as a family asset management arrangement. He said my mother needed to make me feel guilty. He said guilt was the best financial instrument he knew. My mother did not argue. She asked how long it would take. Fiona said I'd always been intimidated by her. She said I would do whatever kept the peace. She said I had been doing it my whole life. I stood on the porch with my hand on the railing and the envelope pressed against my chest. The air smelled like the neighbor's fireplace. A dog was barking somewhere down the street. Everything was perfectly ordinary and completely devastating at the same time. I was a data forensics analyst. I had spent 4 years working for a firm that specialized in financial litigation support, which meant I spent my days finding the things people tried to hide in numbers. I knew how to read a fraudulent document before most people finished reading the title. I knew what coercion looked like on paper. And standing on that porch, I understood with cold, crystalline clarity that what I was hearing through that window was not a family gathering. It was a strategy meeting. I stood there for a full minute. I did not cry. I did not feel the specific sharp pain of betrayal the way people describe it in books, like a knife or a punch. It felt more like a floor disappearing. One moment there was something solid under me, and then there was not. Then I straightened my spine, put my key in the door, and walked in. I made my face do exactly what they expected. I let my shoulders drop. I let my eyes go a little glassy. I walked into the living room looking like a woman who had just survived 8 months of legal grief and was exhausted all the way through, which was not entirely an act. My mother rushed toward me first. She hugged me with both arms, the way she only did when she wanted something. She told me she was so proud of me. She said my father would have been proud too. Over her shoulder, I could see Philip watching me with the focused attention of a man calculating something. Fiona stayed on the couch. She patted the cushion next to her and told me to sit down, that I looked tired, that I needed to let the family take care of things for a while. She said it the way you say it, when taking care of things means taking care of things for yourself. My brother, whose name was Owen, was leaning against the doorframe to the kitchen. He was the quietest of all of them, which I had always mistaken for neutrality. I understood that evening that silence is not the same thing as innocence. I sat. I accepted the glass of water my mother handed me. I let Philip start talking. He launched into it smoothly, the way a man does when he has rehearsed. He said he had been doing some research on estate management on my behalf because he was worried about me. He said large settlements, when left in standard accounts without professional guidance, were vulnerable to tax exposure and poor allocation. He said he had spoken to some contacts and put together a preliminary framework that would protect the assets long term. He slid a folder across the coffee table toward me. I picked it up. The document inside was labeled as a family trust restructuring proposal. It was 12 pages, professionally formatted, and designed to look exactly like something produced by a legitimate financial institution. What it actually was, dressed up in clean typography and legal-sounding language, was a request for me to sign over primary management authority of my inheritance to Philip's private advisory firm, with my mother listed as secondary trustee. I read it slowly. I kept my face very still. The document contained a clause on page 8, written in smaller font than the rest, that would give Philip's firm discretionary authority over withdrawals above a certain threshold. Another clause on page 10 established a management fee structure that, compounded annually, would transfer a significant portion of the total assets to his firm within 7 years. There was no exit provision. There was no independent oversight requirement. It was not a protection plan. It was a slow drain with my signature on the permission slip. I looked up at Philip. I let my eyes go a little wet. I said I did not understand all of it, that financial documents made my head spin, that I was just so relieved to have family around me who knew how to handle this kind of thing. Philip's shoulders relaxed about 1/4 of an inch. That was the moment I knew he believed me. I told him I just needed a little time to read through it at home, that it was a big decision and I wanted to sleep on it. He started to push back gently, mentioning time-sensitive tax windows, but my mother put her hand on his arm and said to let me breathe. She knew me well enough to know that pushing too hard would make me resistant. She was managing him the way she had always managed me, which meant she was much more dangerous than he was. I left the house 40 minutes later with the folder under my arm. I told them I loved them. I hugged my mother at the door. I did not look at Philip when I said goodbye. In the car, I sat for a moment, and then I opened my phone and sent one message to my attorney. His name was Mr. Harrington, and he had been my father's personal attorney for over 20 years before becoming mine. I told him I needed an urgent call first thing in the morning and that I had a document he needed to see. Then I drove home. And I started building the case. The next morning, Mr. Harrington called me before 8. I sent him photographs of all 12 pages of Philip's document before we even finished saying hello. I listened to the silence on his end as he read. It was the specific silence of a man who has seen a lot and is still managing to be surprised. He confirmed what I already knew. The document was not technically illegal on its face, but the combination of its clauses would function as a slow financial transfer that would be extremely difficult to challenge once signed, particularly if Philip could establish a pattern of me relying on his guidance. He said the moment I signed anything, the dynamic would shift. He said, "Do not sign anything." I told him I had no intention of signing anything. I told him what I needed instead. I asked Mr. Harrington to quietly finalize the transfer of the settlement funds into a private holding account registered under my name and my name only at an institution my family had no prior relationship with. I asked him to register my sole ownership formally with every relevant federal and state agency time-stamped before the end of the week. And then I asked him one more thing. I asked him to look up whether any commercial or residential properties in the Chicago metro area were currently leased or mortgaged under Philip's advisory firm or any LLC associated with his name. He called me back 4 hours later. His voice was very quiet and very precise. Philip's firm leased office space in a mid-rise building in the River North neighborhood. The building had changed ownership 2 months prior, in the middle of the estate settlement process, when property transactions in my father's portfolio were being reassigned. The new owner of record for that building was a holding company registered in Delaware. The managing member of that holding company was me. I had not even known I owned it yet. Mr. Harrington had been processing the portfolio transfers quietly for weeks, and that building was one of 7 commercial properties my father had acquired over the course of his career. I owned the building Philip paid rent in. I was his landlord, he did not know. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I asked Mr. Harrington to pull Philip's lease file. I asked him specifically whether Philip's firm was current on payments. He was not. Philip's firm was 61 days past due on its commercial lease. The previous property management company had noted multiple promises of incoming capital and had extended informal grace periods twice. There was a penalty clause in the original lease agreement, buried in the operating expense addendum, that allowed the building owner to escalate the monthly rate by 2.5 times if a tenant exceeded 60 days of default. Philip was on day 61. I told Mr. Justicons, Harrington, to draft an escalation notice. I told him to triple the rate per the clause, attach every late fee allowed under the contract, and deliver it to Philip's office the following morning. I told him to give Philip 72 hours to bring the account current or initiate lockout proceedings. Then I told him one more thing. I asked him whether it would be possible, given my role as the building owner, for me to legally request access to the security camera system covering the common areas of the 4th floor where Philip's office was located. Mr. Harrington said yes. As the property owner, I had full administrative access. 2 days passed. During those 2 days, my phone filled up with increasingly warm messages from my mother and Fiona asking how I was feeling, whether I had given the document more thought, whether I wanted to have dinner. Philip texted once, something carefully casual about just checking in and letting me know his calendar was open whenever I was ready to talk. On the 3rd day, the escalation notice landed on his office door. I was watching the camera feed from my laptop when he arrived that morning. I saw him step off the elevator carrying his coffee, walking with the easy confidence of someone who believes the day ahead is going to confirm everything they already think about themselves. I watched him stop. I watched him look at the yellow notice taped to his glass door. I watched him look at the yellow notice taped to his glass door. I watched him read it, and I watched the coffee tip slightly in his hand as his grip changed. He went inside and I could see him on the interior lobby camera, talking very fast to his assistant, who kept nodding and looking at her screen. He disappeared into his private office and closed the door. 11 minutes later he came back out with his coat on and left the building. My phone rang an hour after that. It was Fiona. She said she was just calling to say hi, but within 30 seconds she was asking whether I had thought any more about Philip's proposal, because apparently he was dealing with some cash flow complications at the firm right now, and the timing was actually quite important. She kept her voice casual, but I could hear the edges of something sharp underneath it. She said families should support each other during difficult periods. She said my father would have wanted that. I said I was still thinking about it. I said I was still thinking about it. I said I needed more time. She said time was actually a little bit of an issue. She said maybe we could all sit down together that weekend, all of us, to talk through it in person. She said she thought being around family would help me feel less overwhelmed. I agreed to Saturday. I said I would be there. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and pulled up every public record I could access on Philip's firm. As a forensic data analyst, I had access to corporate filing databases, commercial property records, and litigation histories that average people do not know are publicly searchable. What I found over the next 48 hours was not a financial advisory firm experiencing a temporary rough patch. It was the skeletal remains of a company that had been structurally unsound for years. Philip had incorporated 3 separate LLCs over the past decade. 2 of them had been voluntarily dissolved after failing to meet state filing requirements. The 3rd was current on paper but showed no meaningful revenue in its most recent disclosure. He had taken out a personal line of credit using Fiona's name as a co-borrower. He had a civil judgment against him from 4 years ago. A former client who claimed mismanagement of funds settled quietly out of court. He had borrowed money from my mother at least twice, amounts I found referenced in the estate records my father's accountant had prepared. The proposal he had slid across the coffee table was not a plan to protect my inheritance. It was a transfusion. He needed my money the way a person in freefall needs a rope, and he had been planning to use my grief and my family's influence to hand it to him before I was steady enough to read the fine print. I compiled everything into a documented file and sent it to Mr. Harrington. Saturday came. I drove to my mother's house in the late afternoon, parked on the street, and sat in the car for exactly the amount of time it took me to make sure I was ready. I was wearing a good blazer. I had my phone in my pocket with my recording app already running, which was legal in Illinois under single-party consent laws. I carried a leather portfolio under my arm that looked like I had brought documents to sign. Inside, it was just the four of them. My mother at the kitchen table, Fiona on the couch with her legs crossed, wearing the particular expression she had always used when she was pretending not to care very much about something. Philip standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, performing relaxed. Owen was in the corner chair scrolling his phone, present but uninvested. My mother made tea. We sat. Philip started. He said he knew the escalation notice on his office lease must look alarming, but that it was simply an administrative error from the new property management company, already being resolved. He said these things happen during ownership transitions. He said it was not relevant to the conversation we needed to have. I nodded slowly. I said I was sorry to hear that. That property management disputes were so stressful. He moved on. He said he had revised the proposal slightly based on feedback he received from his contacts, and he pushed a new folder across the table. I opened it. The new version had cosmetic changes, softer language, but the core structure was identical. The discretionary authority clause was still there now on page 6 instead of 8. The management fee structure had been adjusted to look smaller per year, but extended over a longer term. The total transfer was actually larger than the original version. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at him. I said I had a question. I said I had been doing some reading, that I wanted to understand how his firm was structured, and that I had come across some public records I was hoping he could explain. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. I asked him about the 2 dissolved LLCs. I asked him about the civil judgment from 4 years ago. I asked him about the line of credit in Fiona's name and whether she had been informed about its current balance. Fiona looked at him very quickly. I asked about the money he had borrowed from my mother during the past 3 years and whether she had expected to be repaid, and whether she understood that the management fees in his proposal would effectively flow backward through the family, rather than providing her with any real financial protection. My mother set down her tea. Philip's voice went carefully flat. He said I was misreading public records. He said those LLCs were dissolved for strategic restructuring reasons. He said the civil matter was baseless and settled. He said I was clearly still overwhelmed by grief and making emotional assessments of financial information I did not have the context to interpret correctly. He said I should let people who understood these things handle it for me. I set his folder on the table. I did not slide it back to him. I just set it down and left my hand flat on top of it. I told him I actually did understand these things. I told him I had spent 4 years doing financial forensics for litigation firms, which meant I had spent 4 years finding exactly the kinds of structures he had just described to me, in exactly this kind of document, and presenting them to federal judges. I told him that the management fee arrangement on page 6 of his revised proposal, compounded over the term outlined on page 9, represented a projected transfer of approximately $11 million away from my accounts and into his firm, with no legally enforceable mechanism for me to recover it once signed. The room went very quiet. I told him that I also wanted to let him know, as a courtesy, that the administrative error on his office lease was not an administrative error. I told him that my father's estate included a portfolio of commercial properties in the Chicago area. I told him that during the settlement process, those properties had been transferred into a holding company registered under my name. I told him that one of those properties was a mid-rise building in River North. I watched his face go through several things very quickly. I told him I was his landlord. I told him I had been his landlord for 6 weeks. I told him the escalation notice was entirely valid, issued under a clause he had agreed to when he signed his original lease, and that he was currently on day 64 of default, which meant the lockout threshold had already been crossed. I told him the only reason the lockout had not yet been executed was that Mr. Harrington had advised me to wait until this conversation had taken place. Philip stood up. He said I was bluffing. He said there was no way my father had owned that building. He said there was no way my father had owned that building. He said he would have known. He said my father was an engineer who drove a used car and wore cheap shoes. I opened the leather portfolio I had carried in. I set the property deed on the table. I set the holding company registration next to it. I set the lease file on top, with the default notices and the penalty clause highlighted in yellow. Owen, who had not said a single word since I arrived, put down his phone. Fiona stood up and walked to the window with her back to the room. I could see her shoulders doing something complicated. My mother picked up the property deed. She looked at it for a long time. When she set it down, her face had a quality I had never seen on it before, which was the specific expression of a person realizing that the person they thought they were managing has been watching them the entire time. I told Philip that I had one offer to make and I was only going to make it once. I told him that if he withdrew the proposal, ceased all communication with me regarding financial arrangements, and brought his lease current within 72 hours, I would not initiate the lockout and I would not forward the documentation I had compiled to the State Financial Advisory Licensing Board, which had specific jurisdiction over the conduct he had described in that proposal. I told him the documentation was already prepared and already saved with Mr. Harrington. He asked what documentation. I told him the document he had prepared for me met the statutory definition of a fraudulent investment scheme under Illinois law, because it contained materially misleading representations about fee structures and failed to disclose the conflicts of interest required by his advisory license. I told him I was not a prosecutor and I was not making a legal determination. I was simply noting that if the licensing board received a complaint and the attached materials, they would make that determination themselves. Philip sat back down slowly. He looked like a man who had just understood that the elevator he stepped into was, in fact, a different kind of machine entirely. I told him he had until Monday morning. I picked up my portfolio, closed it, and stood up. I looked at my mother. I told her I loved her. I told her that I hoped she would think carefully about the financial arrangements she had made with Philip over the past several years, and that Mr. Harrington's office was available to her if she ever wanted an independent review of her own exposure. I told her I was not angry with her. I told her I was just done. I looked at Fiona. I did not say anything. I walked out of the living room, through the foyer and out the front door. I did not look back. On Sunday evening, Mr. Harrington forwarded me an email from Philip's personal account. It was addressed to him as my attorney of record. It contained a 2-paragraph statement formally withdrawing the proposal and noting that Philip's firm would be ceasing all advisory communications with me going forward. Attached to it was a wire transfer confirmation showing the full outstanding balance on his commercial lease, including the late fees, deposited to the property management account. He had paid it overnight. He had borrowed the money from somewhere I never asked about. He had paid it, and he had walked away. 3 weeks later, I received notice through Mr. Harrington that Philip's firm had surrendered its office lease and vacated the building. He had given notice quietly, moved whatever he had out over a weekend, and left without fanfare. The 4th floor was empty by the 1st of November. I eventually leased it to a legitimate commercial tenant, a small architecture firm, and every dollar of that rent goes directly into the trust my father built. Fiona and I have not spoken since October. She sent me a text 2 months after the Saturday meeting, short and formal, asking if I was okay. I read it. I did not respond. That sounds cold when I say it out loud. But what I know about my own sister now is not something that resolves with a text message. Some doors, once you see clearly what is on the other side, you do not open again. My mother is a more complicated story. We have spoken several times since then. She does not bring up Philip. I do not bring up what I heard through the window that first evening. We talk about small things, careful things, the way people do when they are both working around a large object in the middle of the room. I do not know yet what that becomes over time. I am letting myself not know. Owen called me on my birthday in February. He said he was sorry. He said he had not known how far Philip had taken it, that he thought it was going to be a conversation about financial planning and not what it turned out to be. He said he should have said something. He said he did not know what he was afraid of, only that he had been afraid and that he was sorry. I believed him, which surprised me. I told him I would think about it. We have talked twice since then, which is more than we talked in the year before any of this happened. I live in a different apartment now, on the north side of the city, with large windows that face east and catch the morning light. I still work in data forensics. I sit down at my desk most mornings with a cup of coffee, and I look at numbers and I find the things people try to hide, and I am good at it. My father knew I would be good at it. He used to say that the most important thing in any field is paying attention, that most people are not paying attention, and that this is both the sadness of the world and its opportunity. He was a quiet man who wore cheap shoes and drove a used car and built something real over the course of a very long, very careful life. He left me the tools he spent 30 years assembling. What I did with them was my own. I do not think of what happened as a victory, exactly. I think of it as a clarification. I learned who my family was when they thought I was not paying attention. And then I paid attention and I used every skill I had ever built, and I protected what was mine. That is enough. It is more than enough. If you have ever had to protect yourself from the people you thought would protect you, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this one resonated with you, subscribe to Restoration Stories. There are more of us out here than you think. I have thought a lot about what Philip said through that open window. He said grief makes people easy. He said it like it was a fact he had tested and confirmed, like it was a reliable variable he could plug into a plan. And the thing is, he was not entirely wrong. Grief does make you soft in certain places. It loosens something in your chest that you normally keep held tight. You want to trust people more, not less, because the alternative, that the people around you are measuring your vulnerability like a resource, is too bleak to sit with when you are already carrying so much. What he miscalculated was that soft and unaware are not the same thing. He assumed my grief had made me careless. It had actually made me very, very careful. I think about the specific shape of what he tried to do, and what it required of him as a person. He had to look at me, a 29-year-old woman who had just spent 8 months fighting for her father's estate, while working full-time and sleeping badly, and missing a man who wore cheap sneakers and never stopped being kind to her. He had to look at all of that and see an opportunity. That is not a mistake or a lapse in judgment. That is a choice someone makes about what other people are worth. Every person who helped him make that choice, everyone who sat in that room and said nothing, made a version of the same choice. I am not angry about it anymore, or not in the active way I was for a while. What I feel now is more like clarity. When someone shows you how they think about you when they believe you cannot hear them, that is the most accurate information you will ever receive about who they are. Everything before that moment, every holiday dinner, every birthday card, every phone call, gets recontextualized. You are not discovering something new. You are finally seeing something that was always true. What I learned from my father, watching him over the course of my entire life, was that integrity is mostly invisible. He did not perform his values, he just lived them, quietly, in the choices nobody saw. He drove a used car because he cared more about what the money became than what it signaled. He wore those shoes because he had decided what actually mattered to him, and he did not need anything else to prove it. He built something real over 30 years, not by being flashy or aggressive or by exploiting the people around him, but by paying attention and doing honest work and letting the results accumulate. The skills I used to protect what he left me, the forensic training, the patience, the ability to read a document for what it actually says, rather than what it claims to say. Those came from watching him. They came from understanding that the most important thing in any situation is to know more than the other person assumes you know. Philip thought he was the one with the information advantage. He had no idea. I think the hardest thing about what happened is not what Fiona and Philip did. It is that I had to learn at 29 that protecting yourself sometimes means letting go of the version of your family you always hoped you were part of. That is not a lesson that comes easy. It sits in you for a while before it settles. But I sit at my desk most mornings now, in good light, doing work I am good at, living in a life that is genuinely mine. My father built something real. I am learning to do the same. That, in the end, is the only inheritance that actually matters.